Welcome back. We just told you about Governor Rick Scott's proposal, Finish in 4, Save More. It would help college students save money and help them graduate with undergraduate degrees in 4 years by broadening Bright Future scholarships to cover more classes, eliminating sales tax on textbooks, freezing all fees at state colleges and universities, and capping their tuition at state colleges. Joining us for more to discuss Governor Scott's proposal are Thomas Vo from the State College of Florida, Jacob Harding from the Out of Door Academy, and Michael Snipes from the University of South Florida. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. And Jacob, I'll start with you because you deal on the front end with students and parents, many of whom have angst.
Yes, absolutely.
When they are starting this. And I'm going through this myself because my son's going to be going to college next year. And I know that when parents get into this process, they're so often, encountering sticker shock.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of misinformation out there, right? And I think that's one of the biggest issues in higher education. I think that there's an inherent value in advising. Hopefully, I think I find value in what I'm doing. But many parents come in worried. How are they going to be able to afford this? I'm privileged enough to work at an independent school where we have a large portion of our families who can afford higher education, but we also are about 20% first-generation college student, a lot of kids on scholarships, so their concerns are very real. How can they pay, at the high end $250,000, maybe at the state level $80,000 for college credit?
And of that, it comes under a lot of different categories, but what is the, what part of the tuition package are they most concerned about?
Yeah, so I think it really depends on what type of institution. Obviously, we're talking a lot about state institutions here. So there is the tuition piece. The fees have gone up steadily. Depending on major, those could be higher at some of the state institutions. So that's a cause for concern that a lot of times parents don't think about. The book expense as well is something that isn't generally planned for in a lot of families.
And Thomas, a key part of Governor Scott's proposal here is getting students to graduate in 4 years because it's more efficient. And it costs less, but many students, take an extra semester or another year, and it dries up the cost. So, how do you think this would work?
Well, from my understanding of reading the regulations, is that it's twofold actually with the Bright Futures. It's not only providing funding throughout the summer, it's also making the regulations less stringent. In the 2011-2012 state Bright Futures regulations, they had for the Florida Medallion Scholarship, ACT score minimum of 20 ACT score and a 970 SAT score to qualify. In 2013, the regs became more strict, where it was a minimum ACT score of 26 and also an SAT score of 1170.
And that really impacted a lot of students and families, didn't it?
It did, actually, in the fact that a lot of our minority and economic challenged students actually ended up not being eligible. We saw within that time frame of 2 years, those eligible decreased by 50% from 2011 to 2013.
Michael, on an economic basis, could you give us some kind of sense of what this costs Florida families in terms of their bigger picture?
Sure. I think one of the approaches that we could look at, or one of the things we could look at, is really looking at where Florida ranks relative to other states in terms of the total amount of students, or total amount of debt that students graduate with. And in that respect, Florida's actually doing really well. Florida ranks, I believe it's 47th in terms of the total amount of debt that students graduate with. We're lower than the national average. And in fact, the amount of student debt that students are taking on in Florida is actually decreasing. So this, in 2015, the average, or 2016, the average was $23,000, and that actually had gone down.
$23,000 over 4 years?
Over 4 years.
Right.
Over 4 years, and that had actually gone down from 2015 numbers. So I think, kind of bigger picture, it's important to kind of keep in mind where Florida ranks relative to the rest of the country. We're actually doing pretty well here.
And to chime in on that, the average actually student loan nationally, student loan debt for a 4-year undergraduate education is $30,100 as of 2015. So Florida is, as confirming, is below than the national average at this time.
We have a long way to go before this becomes law and would go into effect, but you're dealing right now with students and families that have to make plans now for what may or may not happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so getting back to what I was talking about before, I think that the value is in advising. I think one of the challenges for a lot of public schools in the state of Florida is an under-advising when it comes to the college process. Simply put, it's a pretty complex process, right? I'm sure you're going through it yourself with FAFSA and CSS profiles and all these other things. And it becomes alphabet soup for a lot of parents. They really can identify what is the important things and what are the things that maybe aren't as important to their child's process, because each process is inherently different. So I think one of the things when we counsel a lot of our lower income students, looking at options out of state, right? One of the offerings that you can look at in out of state privatized options are 100% need met schools, where these schools will meet 100% of your demonstrated interest outside the state of Florida. In the state, unfortunately, we don't have any of those.
Right, but that also depends upon, correct me if I'm wrong, what their GPA is and their test scores, correct?
And so does Bright Futures. And as my colleague said, unfortunately, data has shown, research has shown that minorities generally are at a disadvantage when it comes to standardized testing. Socioeconomic classes are at a disadvantage. There's definitive gaps within the socioeconomic classes for standardized testing. Many of these 100% need met schools actually are test optional, so they don't even look at standardized testing to kind of level the playing field for opportunity.
All right. We are just getting started. Bob will be back with your forecast after this and then more of our conversation, so stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking about Governor Rick Scott's plan to make college more affordable with Thomas Vo of the State College of Florida, Jacob Harding from the Out of Door Academy, and Michael Snipes from the University of South Florida. We were talking in the break that, on one hand, some of the things that this help will go towards is going to cut down in terms of the fees that students and their parents would pay, but that also might create a situation where the state's universities and colleges are hurting for cash if you're freezing fees and tuition. So the question would be, are schools concerned about the impact it's going to have in terms of their bottom line?
Well, while I can't speak on behalf of State College of Florida, there's two stances I feel about this. First off, any chance you can help our students and make college more affordable, whether it be through year-round summer, Bright Futures, and textbook affordability, I'm all for it. But at the same sense, what's it actually costing? This reminds me actually of a similar program when the Department of Ed went with year-round Pell, summer Pell, in 2009, 2010.
Right, but before you get there, that's the other part of it, that a key part of Governor Scott's proposal is to extend the merit scholarships to summer classes so kids could be able to get out in 4 years, but it comes with a hefty price tag. They estimate somewhere between $26 and $47 million. And knowing the composition of the state legislature right now, that's not a gimme that the state legislature would either go for that or continue that into the future.
That's correct. We know that the state Bright Futures funds are funded by the Florida Lottery, but it's also supplemented by our state institutions and state universities as well, 5% in fact, up to 5%. So the problem here is actually gauging how many students are going to be enrolling in the summer and qualifying for this. Getting a true figure between 26 and 47 million. How are we going to be able to really tell and project really? It comes down to analysts and actually doing their studies. But in 2009, 2010, Department of Ed implemented a federal Pell Grant program, and within 2 years, the summer Pell was gone because they projected poorly in the fact that it ended up costing them 5 to 7 times of their projections. So they had to actually get rid of it within 2 years.
Right, and Jacob, I would imagine that's part of the big angst that parents may feel is that they don't know what's going to happen in the future, either on the state level or as we were talking the federal level with Pell Grants.
Absolutely, right. So you can plan, you can have your nest egg, and you can plan for college, but there are tuition increases. Across the country, there are tuition increases. There are schools that do a great job of limiting or freezing their tuition, and there are schools who it's at those most selective Ivy League-esque institutions, you're running in close to $70,000 all in.
Michael, what is the biggest reason why tuition increases in terms of, I mean, does the economy have a huge impact in terms of the overall strength of the economy?
In terms of what you're going to be paying for tuition and fees and things like that, overall the economy doesn't necessarily affect tuition prices. It doesn't necessarily affect fees that you're going to be paying. these are things that do tend to move together, so you do tend to see tuition rising at the same time you see overall prices increasing. But really, when we're looking at what are some of the causes for why tuition has been increasing over the past 20 years, really only a very small amount can be attributed to overall just general price increases. We have to look at other factors that could be increasing tuition
Like
besides.
what?
Well, one of the big factors that's been pointed at in a lot of recent studies has really been looking at the expansion of administrative roles, right? And those tend to be the most highly paid positions at universities are your presidents, your provosts, your deans. Those tend to be the high salary individuals. And the more you have of those type of workers, the more administrators you have, that tends to increase tuition.
And people should keep in mind that college costs in Florida are among the lower in the country.
Certainly, certainly. And again, we go back to some of the points we brought up. Florida is doing fairly well. And I think that at least part of the reason why Florida students tend to graduate with debt lower than the national average, I think there's a couple things that we can look at. Just one in general is Florida's tuition for the state schools does tend to be lower than every other state, most of the other states out there. And we can also look at the effect of, of private schools, because the students that tend to graduate with the most debt tend to come from the Northeast. I believe Connecticut. Students that graduate from Connecticut schools have the most student debt. And when you look at the composure of schools.
Thank goodness I moved from Connecticut to Florida.
Right.
Jacob, let me ask you this. As you counsel parents through this process, what part does the uncertainty about where the state and the federal government will be in terms of its aid come into play in terms of what kind of college that they pick?
So I think there's a lot of trust. I think there's a lot of trust that the families give me and my staff in college counseling to say, this is what it'll cost around and do a lot of the legwork. I think this whole conversation is about two things. It's about affordability and access. Right? And if you look at the reasons why students aren't graduating 4 years, or you're looking at the reasons why it may be taking 6 years and debt is rising, there's only really a handful of kind of data points, right? One is that students aren't getting the advising they need when they get to college, so it's taking them longer to graduate. The other is that they're holding part-time jobs and full-time jobs, something that many of us can relate to in our college experiences. I think the other really big point is looking at change of major. 80% of students change their major while in college, and that can put them on a different track that may take longer. So there's a number of reasons why they may take longer to get through school, right? So the affordability piece. And then the access piece is students just not knowing, right? We know what we're familiar with. For a lot of my independent school parents, it may be some of the more prestigious institutions, right? The Ivy Leagues in the North. For another sect of my family, it's UF and FSU and USF and kind of the flagships of the state. And that's what they're familiar with because they're from Florida. So I think having more education out there, more advising, both in the college level to ensure four-year graduation rates, as well as advising in our public sector is critical.
Another part of this, which I think most people are not aware of, in part of the governor's proposal is to cut the fees for teaching assistants. Some people might think that, if you're a teaching assistant in a school that you would be, working your way towards your education here, and it would be good news if you are helping teaching assistants really make it through college easier.
Well, that's maybe one thing I can speak at, because when I was going through graduate school, I was a teaching assistant, and a lot of the time, a lot of the wages or salaries you're getting as a teaching assistant tend to be fairly low. It's not a huge part of the budget. And so if that was something that we could look at it to maybe try and control costs, would be looking at how much we pay teaching assistants. I would argue that there would be maybe better ways that we could approach things, because the amount of money that goes towards teaching assistants is not going to be a large amount.
So what would be a better way?
What would be a better way? Well, that's a very good question. So some ways that we could maybe try and control, maybe not necessarily the rise in tuition, but maybe the overall cost in general. We could look at some policies maybe after students graduate. Maybe we could look at some ways we could maybe try and control interest rates on student loans. That could be one thing that we could do. Maybe we could expand grace periods. So when you graduate, a lot of the time you have a grace period when you can go and find a job in order to pay down this debt. maybe that's another thing we could look at.
Let me put it this way. If this proposal goes nowhere, where are we going to be in terms of making college more affordable in Florida, or are working families going to continue to be challenged in terms of being able to afford college for their kids?
I think, again, just to stress, the advising up front is critical. For example, your state schools, State College, like State College of Florida, our tuition costs are one of the most valuable in the state, the lowest and most economical. We charge about a little over $102 per credit. Now, if you look at our students, our average student receives nearly $3,300 a year in federal Pell Grant. So the key to upfront is letting students know you're getting $3,300 a year in federal Pell Grant. Your tuition for 24 credits is a little more than $2,400. Your Pell Grant is fully covered. Why do you need a student loan? Is there really a need for that? It's the upfront advising on that. A lot of the student loan debt and student loan debt crisis that's going on right now is, are students actually borrowing for their needs? And that comes down to advising up front, whether it be making students go do entrance counseling up front, or even after they graduate, before they graduate, before they leave, providing that counseling to them as well.
I would imagine, and it's not just to them, it's to their parents, because a lot of families, a lot of people who are watching this right now still have not recovered from the Great Recession of several years ago. So parents may have put aside the money at one point, but it may not be there right now. And so many families may still be in the position that they have to take out those student loans.
Yeah, well, I think so. A lot of these loans, the financial aid is going to be based on earning, right? So FAFSA can be complicated. It can be somewhat daunting.
Just went through it,
right? So but take advantage of it. Seek whatever resources you need to seek, to whether that be at your local school, through a community college or a state college system, to get the advising you need on FAFSA, because that can make a huge difference.
Okay, let's take a pause here, and we're going to return for final thoughts in just a moment. We're talking about Governor Rick Scott's plan to make college more affordable, and our guests join us now for final thoughts. From your perspective, from the college perspective, what do you want folks who are watching this to take away from this conversation and what the governor's proposal?
I think it's a good thing overall for our students. I think it's beneficial to incentivize them to graduate, and providing incentives like your summer Bright Futures program, also your tax-free books purchases is a good thing. And if you look about economically, really, the average student spends about $1,250 a year on books purchases. So that really equals to about $75 in savings. It's not that much money, but it actually could be critical for some of our students as well. The last point I want to make is also, when it comes to the economics and advising up front, meet with your advisor, be proactive, consider maybe, you may not be able to afford to go to a private school. Go to a community college and actually meet with them, actually think about the articulation agreements they have, the more affordable options they have available for 2 years associate's degree that actually can transfer to a 4-year.
Jacob, I would imagine your job is a little bit difficult right now because you don't know exactly what the landscape will be for next fall.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is data is always live in college counseling and in the college admission process. I will say, any education, any money invested in education is a good investment, whether that's personal or at the state level. So there is always good things to come from any type of investment. Our families are pretty fortunate, as my colleagues have pointed out. The debt is pretty low in Florida. We have got a robust community college and state college system that students should take advantage of. And overall, we've got very high quality higher education in the state.
Michael, is it possible to forecast how many more families and students will be able to get a college education in Florida if this goes through?
That's a difficult thing to do because there's not a whole lot of proposals that have been done nationally or in other states in which things like this have been done. And so there's really not a whole lot of data points that we can use to kind of compare against. But one thing that I think we need to keep in mind is that student debt is the most collectible type of debt there is. I mean, you can't declare bankruptcy on student debt. So anything that we can do, whether it's some of the proposals, some of the ideas, and certainly counseling, I think is a wonderful idea. Anything that we can do to kind of keep that debt to a minimum is certainly going to be a good thing, and some of these policies certainly could help.
And it might be helpful to be able to refinance that
Absolutely.
debt. All right. Before we go, we want to talk about what we did last Friday on ABC7, a recap of President Donald Trump's first week in office. The president has already signed more than a dozen executive orders, from opting out of TPP to building the wall with Mexico. Dozens of you shared your thoughts, including on the last executive executive action restricting immigrants from 7 countries from entering the U.S. B. Kyles writes, does not matter why they are here. Being detained is a great idea until they are proven to be here for a legitimate reason. No more BS. Americans and America first. But Billy Brooks writes, mass stupidity is spreading, yet Saudi Arabia princes can commit crimes and fly back home in private jets. Beverly Morrell writes, I feel like I have entered the Twilight Zone. Well, if you'd like to join the conversation about tonight's topic, just visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/news@7. And FYI, want to watch past Roundtable discussions? They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. I want to thank our guests for being here tonight.